Hi not board gamers, and welcome back to Not Board Gaming. I'm your host, I'm Mark. Now in today's episode we're going to be having a look at the solo game in the latest in the line of the T games from Daniele Tascini and David Turczi. And of course today we're talking about Tekhenu, Obelisk of the Sun, published by Board and Dice, and as I say, designed by Daniele Tascini and David Turczi. Now, this is the latest in the T line of games. Of course, we also have Tzolk'in, the main calendar, and Teotihuacan, and Tekhenu came out a little bit earlier this year. So what is Tekhenu? Well, Tekhenu is effectively a dice drafting game, and if you've played Teotihuacan, you kind of know some of the DNA that's shared here. You're going to choose certain dice which will allow you to perform actions, and those actions will either reap you rewards in terms of victory points or resources as you battle against Botan Carmen, which is this bot, the AI bot in the solo game, to try and get the most victory points at the end of the game. Like a lot of people, I had no idea what the word Tekhenu stands for, so I did a little bit of research, and Tekhenu is actually an old Kemite, which is an ancient Egyptian language, which means to pierce the sky, and it actually means obelisk as well. So obelisk is the Greek word for that. So Tekhenu, Obelisk of the Sun, almost repeats the name twice for you. It's obelisk, obelisk of the sun, if you like, or Tekhenu, Tekhenu of the sun. And the sun plays a really key part in this. So we'll have all seen these kind of large needles that you see around the world, you know, Cleopatra's needle, etc., etc. Those are these Tekhenus, these obelisks, basically. And rather cleverly, what Tekhenu, Obelisk of the Sun, does is it uses the central obelisk as the sun shining down on it and creating shadow and light, and that shadow and light plays a very, very, very important part in the kinds of dice you can choose to perform your action, and they change every time the obelisk rotates. Sounds a little bit confusing, but as we delve into the game a little bit more, you'll find out just how thematic that is. So we know it's set in ancient Egyptian times, and the back of the box gives you a good indication of the time it's set in, cleverly without telling you much about how the game itself plays. So let me read this out to you. 4 millennia ago, on the eastern bank of the Nile River, a foundation for what was to become the temple of Amun-Ra was laid. Over the course of 2,000 years, the temple complex was gradually expanded until it became the largest religious building in the world. Today, that site is known as Karnak. Travel back in time and join the ancient pharaohs in creating one of the most impressive sights the world has seen. Witness and influence 2,000 years of history, building, strategizing and honoring the Egyptian gods Horus, Ra, Hathor, Bastet, Thoth and Osiris. Manage and balance your actions carefully, as when the reckoning by the goddess Maat comes, your heart will be weighed, and a judgment of your deeds will determine your fate. So yeah, as I say, that gives you an indication of the time period it's set in. It tells you little bits about what's in the game itself, the building, the strategizing, the Maat phase, and how your deeds are going to be weighed, but it doesn't give away too much about how the game is played. So what we'll do is I'll have a look at how you set it up for the solo game. We'll have a look at the components while we're doing that as well. Tell you a little bit about what you do and how you play it, and then we'll go into my thoughts on Tekhenu, Obelisk of the Sun, designed by Daniele Tascini and David Turczi with the solo mode. Obviously it's David Turczi, so there's a David Turczi solo mode in there, and published by Board and Dice. So here we go. I have actually set the board up for a solo game here, and as you can see, it's very, very, very impressive. The look of the board itself, the artwork, kind of speaks to these dusty times and these dusty climes. And, you know, the game is defined by this central plastic obelisk here. As you can see, it's a nice, and I've seen people paint this online, a nice plastic obelisk, which kind of goes in the middle of the board. One second while I put that back on. Middle of the board, and this acts as a rotating mechanism which will allow you to choose certain dice, and we'll come on to that in a wee while. We also have some various tokens as well. So we have gold, papyrus, limestone, other stone, bread, faith, and scribe tokens, and you will use them as the game progresses to either kind of collect to pay people, as in the form of bread, or to use gold as any resource, or scribe to potentially change the value of dice, die that you pull out, and maybe pull a very special action. And then the other resources, well, the faith tokens help you balance your scales, and I'll come on to that in a wee while. And then the limestone and the other quarry stone, that's to help you build things. But there's also other aspects as well. So I've also set up a couple of player boards. Now for the solo game, you don't need an AI player board. All I do is I use one of these unpunched boards just to keep my AI, the bottom Carmen's kind of stuff on there. But you don't necessarily need a board out for the AI, so we can almost disregard that. Let's have a look over here. First of all, we have our columns at the top. Then we have our buildings here, we have our statues at the bottom. These are our resources, and the numbers at the side dictate how many resources you can hold. And here we have the scales. You'll notice there's almost a light feather and a dark urn on there, or a tainted urn on there. And I'll come on to how these work in a second, but that's where you're going to put your dice when you pull them off the board. And depending on whether you took them from a light part of the wheel or a shaded part of the wheel, depends on where they go on there. And at the end of your round, you have to balance those up, and that'll decide who's going to go first next round. So that's the player board. As I say, over here we've got the AI player board. You don't use any resource cubes, but you do use the statues, the buildings, and the columns, and that's really it for the AI there. So the central mechanic in the game is this almost rondelle area here, but you're not going to go around it and choose, move one space, etc. You can literally choose any action from this rondelle area, and these are all the various gods that are around here. You have Ra, you have Hathor, you have Bastet, you have Thoth, Osiris, and Horus around the board there. And cleverly, in the middle, you can see the central obelisk. Now, this disc shifts each and every, once there's at least two dice on the player mat, then the disc is going to shift. If it's 4 dice, then it will shift and cause a mat phase, and that's a slightly different part of the game. But you can see here, so if we look here, we have the dark area means that it's shaded from the sun, so the sun will be over in this direction. These two, or it's in the dark from the sun, should I say. These two areas on the side, that's where it's shaded, so it's not quite in the sun and it's not quite in the dark. And over here is on the where it's light, is where the sun is hitting it. Now, as the sun travels throughout the day, that means, or throughout your play, that means this area is going to shift and turn, and that changes the format of where the dice are. So you can see at the bottom, and there's 2 sides to this disc. You can have a side without these diagrams on, or a side with the diagrams on if you're without the diagram if you're hardcore, or with them on if you're like me and need to refer to them all the time. And as the disc shifts, the position of your dice will move. For example, on here, we're in the darkness phase. That means that the yellow dice and the white dice cannot be used. I cannot take them to use an action this game, so they stay here in this kind of forbidden area. And then in the middle we have the grey, the tainted area. So if you like, it's almost the tainted area. These are tainted dice, and here we have the grey and the brown. And as you can see, I've got 2 grey dice there. Grey will always be in this tainted area, and in the dark, there you go, you've only got the black dice you can use. I only have 1 black die there, and that's there. So that means if I was to choose any of these 2 actions on this while the obelisk is there, I could only choose either one of those 2 grey dice or that black die. I can't choose the white die. However, as you progress in the game and you get 2 dice on your player board, once you've taken 2 dice, you will then rotate that disc. So as you can see here, this is still in the darkness, so this doesn't move. But here, these dice will change now. So my black die is going to go up into the tainted. The white die is going to go down into use, and I could also put, white die is also going to go down to tainted, so that can be used as a dice now. If I had any yellow or brown ones on this particular go, they would go there, and that would shift again the very next phase. So there we go, and now this would mean that the white die would go into the into the bright use, if you like, so it could definitely be used, and the black die would go and be unable to be used, and that's how the rotating kind of obelisk works in the game itself. It moves the dice around, and those dice dictate which actions you can take. So let's talk about those actions. There are, of course, various other things as well. There are various cards in the form of blessings, technology, or decrees, and they will kind of help you out and assist you throughout the game, but you have to pay a cost to get those cards. There's also the happiness and population markers as well, and that's kind of a key thing, because the happier that you are, then the more these technology and blessing cards that you can get, and also helps towards end game scoring as well. And there are the column tiles as well, where you will build your columns. But there's quite a lot going on in this game, so I'm not here to give you an overview on every single aspect of the game itself. So this is obviously a Daniele Tascini and David Turczi game, and therefore your actions are going to take the form of one of any number of variably interconnected actions. You see, you will potentially maybe need to get more resources of a particular type, and to get more resources of a particular type you have to do another action first, which will allow you to get those resources. And you can see how that works throughout the board. Most of these actions are pretty much connected and pretty thematic. Not all of them totally thematic, but pretty thematic. So let me show you how that works, because how you take those actions, the die, and where you take those dice from becomes a really key and focal part of the game. So when we talk about interconnectedness, I'm going to talk about one particular action, which is an Osiris action. If we look down here on my player board, you can see down here that all my production markers are down at 2. That means I can only ever have a maximum of 2 particular resource, but you need to increase that resource as the game progresses to ensure that you can collect more resources and give you access to more ghosts. So how do I do that? Well, if we look up here on this part of the board here, which is the kind of the quarry and the papyrus section, the bakery, etc. This is where you can take an action to absolutely increase your resources. And how do you do that? Well, if we have a look over here on the Osiris, and that's the relevant space for it here, we can see that there are 3 dice. There was a grey 5, there's a grey 1, and a yellow 2. Now, the colour of the dice you take can be very important depending on what action you're choosing, but also obviously it's important on where it stands on the wheel itself. But also if you're taking resources, each colour stands for a resource. But more so, the pips on the die are important because they generally dictate the key action for you. So for Osiris, what I need to do, if I want to increase my my production markers, I'm going to take an Osiris action on my go. So I'm going to take this yellow 2 here, and I'm going to put it down on my board, if you look down here, on the light side of the scales. Now the scales are going to play a big part as you progress the game. And that means that I have a 2 on here. So what this also means as well is I will then, in this particular action space here, is I'm going to do anything on column 2. Now the first thing you do when you take a building action is you knock your happiness down by 1, and that's this marker here, and I'm going to move that down to there because that will always cost me 1 happiness. Then I'm going to take my leftmost building on my player board, and don't worry about this here because that only comes into play in the scoring phase here. I'm going to take that and I'm going to place it anywhere on this second row to give me a boost. So if I want papyrus, I'll place it there. I will get a papyrus resource, and I will also increase my papyrus marker by production marker by 1. Same for bread, same for limestone and the other stone. So there we go. So let's say I do that and I want to increase my, I don't know, my limestone. So I place that on there. I'm going to take a single limestone marker and put that on there, and I'm going to then increase my limestone production by 1. That means I can now hold 3 of these resources. However, because I placed it on the second row on here, which is a little bit fortuitous. Now on this, the first person to place any on this second row gets this gold token as well, which is really good resource because that gold can be used for anything, and there's no kind of limit on the amount of gold that you can hold as well. So now, you know, I've increased my limestone by 1, I've increased my limestone production by 1, and I've got a gold as well, and I put a light die on here. So you can already see that there's an interconnected action there. By using that Osiris action, that's allowed me to place a building onto the board, it's allowed me to increase my limestone production by 1 and get a 1 additional limestone resource. And I'm going to need that limestone resource if I want to build columns up at the top, because they generally cost limestone and stone to build. And that's how you can increase your resources there as well. You can also increase your resources on your turn by taking any 1 die from any light or tainted area other than grey. So if I was to take this brown die, I could then take 5 brown resources, and the brown is bread. However, at the moment that's pointless for me because I can only hold 2 resources. So that would mean that I could put 2 resources into my reserves, but then the other 3 that I couldn't use, I would have to add them to the tainted area of my scale. So let's talk about that. You see, because every time every player has 2 dice on their player mat, then the obelisk is going to take 1 rotation. And we already know that by rotating that obelisk 1, then the dice are going to move around into either the kind of light, the tainted, or the unusable area of the board. So you've got to start thinking a little bit forward. If I don't take this dice now, will I get access to it later? Or if I wait a turn, can I get access to another dice? And that happens every time there's 2 dice on there. Whenever there's 4 dice on there, so you will then take another go, another 2 turns, so you've taken your 4 turns, and the obelisk will turn again, and then that will trigger a mat phase. And a mat phase effectively allows you to balance your scales, find out how many tainted die you've taken, how many light die you've taken, and that will dictate your position on the mat marker, and that dictates who goes first the next phase. Let me show you a little bit about that. So let's assume that I've taken 4 actions. So the obelisk is turned twice, and I'm now in the mat phase. And 2 of my dice I've taken from the kind of light area and 2 from the tainted area. What you do is you kind of add up these and add up that, and any over or under then dictates your kind of mat, your position on the mat marker, and I'll show you that in a second as to who goes first next time. It also affects scoring as well at the end of the game, and in the solo game and other games as well. It can absolutely cost you victory points. So, for example, here I've got a total of 5 light, and I've got 9 in the shade. That means I am -4, which it means, you know, certainly in the solo game, that's way too much of a difference to actually beat the AI in their go. What you can do is, if you've got any of these faith tokens you've collected, you can use those in mitigation. So that would give me 6 in total against 9, so I'd only be -3. But that's not good. So there's a real kind of balance that you've got to do in trying to understand where you're taking the dice and where you're placing them from, should I say, from whether it's light or the tainted, to try and achieve that balance in the mat phase. Because as we move over to the mat marker, you'll see that it can cost you victory points. So because I know I was -4, what that would do mean is I would take my, I would have a look at my this mat phase here, and at -4 there means I would lose 1 victory point, which is not great. You see, in the solo game, the AI gets a certain amount of mats. So on the first mat phase, it's +3. The second mat phase, it's +2. And on the third and fourth mat phase, it's +1. And that means for me to go first and not lose victory points, I have to try and beat their score. So on a +3, I got -4. Doesn't matter if it's plus or minus, as long as I'm in front there. I'm not. I would lose 1 victory point, and that would put me second for the next go. One of the daunting things about the game when you first start to play it is understanding the round structure. It can seem a little bit overwhelming when you first start to play, but in reality, it's not too bad. You see, every 2 turns of the obelisk, there's a mat phase, and that mat phase will then determine who goes first, whether it's you or the bot in the solo game, and also that can determine which cards the bot gets as well, which is some valuable resources you may need. Then every 2 mat phases, there's a scoring phase, and there are 2 scoring phases in the game, and they are cleverly dictated to you by these kind of tokens that are on the board. So when the obelisk hits the smaller token, or the smaller looking token with 1 sandtimer on there, that's the first scoring phase. When it hits the next one, which is with the 2 sandtimers on there, that's the final scoring phase, and you will do your final score. So it seems initially complex, but if you break it down into every 2 turns there's a mat phase, and every 2 mat phases there's a scoring phase, you should be okay with the structure of how the game plays. So far we've only really talked about the Osiris go as well, but you get the gist. Is the dice, where you take them from, and the pips on there can dictate what action you are going to take, and some of the actions you are going to take are going to require you to have certain resources, so you've really got to start planning ahead. As we go around the board, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 god actions that you can take. There's also the gain resources action, which, as I said earlier, you take the dice and you get the resource of that colour. And there's also an Anubis action, and that is if you manage to collect these scribe tokens, which you can collect by doing other actions. These do 1 or 2 things. First of all, a singular scribe token will allow you to move the value of any die that you choose up or down by 1 or 2 pips. But if you have 2, you can then perform what's called an Anubis action. And what you would do for that is you would take any die from anywhere on the board of any face value and use that die to perform any action. So it's like a super action if you want. And if used well, it can be very, very, very effective. So the other actions that you can take are, you can build statues. And when you build a statue like this, you're going to put it on one of the areas on the board, and that's a Horus action. When you build that statue, that means that anybody else that takes an action on that particular space at any part in the game has to grant you a bonus which is dictated to you on the board. There's the Ra action, which is about building these columns in the temple district, and that will get you more points. You align your columns, and it will also get you more resources, and at the end of the game that can be a really big scoring mechanism. There's the Hathor action, which allows you to build buildings around the temple complex where you are putting your columns, and that again creates more points for you and again allows you to get more resources from there. There's the Bastet action, which is all about happiness, and down the happiness track you've got your little marker and your population marker, and you want to try and increase that as much as possible, because the more you increase that, certainly on the population side, the more cards that are available to you, and I'll talk about cards in a second, and also the better your ability for your end scoring for your happiness is also as well. It also allows you that action as well to get your scribe tokens as well, so you can start to see it's interconnected about where you take these actions. There's the Thoth action, which is where you're going to start taking cards from the board. Now, the cards are broken down into three types of cards. You're going to have your blessing cards, which are these here. You're going to have your technology cards, which are these here. And you're also going to have your decree cards, which are these here. The blessing cards, you keep them and you use them once and then discard them. And they give you a one-hit bonus. So, for example, on this one, when producing, if I've got this particular blessing card, it says when producing resources, take the action twice. That will allow me to earn twice the amount of resources. Then if we look at technology cards, these provide ongoing bonuses, and that's these cards here. And this one says when you perform a Thoth action, gain 1 papyrus, and that would happen for the rest of the game. And then finally we have our decree cards. These are really valuable if you can get these, because these dictate your end of game scoring. And this one says to me on here, as well as my standard scoring, that I would then get 2 victory points for every pillar within the temple complex. So that's really, really useful if you're into building strategy, and 2 victory points per building around the temple complex. And that can absolutely start to dictate your game. But don't get me wrong, these decree cards aren't easy to get. You've got to have your population marker further up the board to give you access to those. The cards do not underestimate how important getting the right cards is for your game. So that's the Thoth action, and then finally we've got the Osiris action, which is the one we talked about, which is where I take a building and I'm going to build it in the quarry or in the workshops and get the available resources. And that's it in terms of the actions you can take. There are effectively 6 main actions, 1 Anubis action that you can take if you've got enough scribe token, and 1 gather resource action. So your number of choices aren't massive, but how you link those together and plan for those really create this massively kind of strategic game where you're thinking about the long game to build up the maximum amount of resources. Let's talk about Tutankhamun. If you're familiar with Teotihuacan, you're probably going to be semi-familiar with the Tutankhamun bot that David Turczi created for Tekhenu, Obelisk of the Sun. You see, in Teotihuacan, they've got this wonderful pyramid system where you would lay out these tiles and then you would move tiles around each and every go, and they would create an ever-changing kind of structure for the bot's turns. A similar thing happens here in Tekhenu. So if we look here, you'll see that I have a pyramid laid out of various actions. Just move that for the moment. And this is your marker token. On the very first go, I'm going to move that on to there. You don't flip a coin or anything for the first go, you just move it onto whatever is your bottom tile. Purely by luck, all my resource tiles are on the bottom here. And what I would do then for this action is I would look for the highest value, so the highest white die on the board that has with the most number of pips, and I would take that and I would put that onto his particular onto his player board. And if I look at the board at the moment, unfortunately, there are no available dice I can take, because all my white dice here are actually in the unusable go. So what I would then do, moving back to this down here, is I would then move to the very next one on. So then I'd look for the highest available black die. And let's have a look here. and we can see, if I look at the board, that the highest available black die is actually this one here. So it's a tainted die from a Hathor action. Put that on his board, and that means I will now take a Hathor go. So whichever kind of section you take the dice from, that's the go that you're going to take. And the Teobot has slightly different actions, although they are connected to the main game in terms of the action that he takes. But bear in mind that all his actions are geared towards him kind of getting more points, putting buildings, putting statues on there. So that would happen. You don't have to balance the AI bots, the bottom Carmen's dice at all, so it doesn't matter in terms of where you put them, whether it's light or tainted. They will just take the dice, and it will always be, if it's on the resources here, it will always be from the highest available dice on the board. Now, what you would then do is, for his next go, you're going to flip this coin, and you can see that this coin here has this here, which means that you would move up the board, or that there, which would move left or right. And there you go, you flip the coin, and that means that for his next go, he would go there, and he would go to the board, and he would take the highest brown die, highest value brown die that's on there, and then take the action that's associated with the god from the area where it comes from. And that's how it would work. You would do that, and then when you get to each and every map phase, what you do is you take those, shuffle them, lay them out in a new pyramid, and start all over again. And working the AI bot is surprisingly easy in this game. But do not get suckered into the fact that just because the AI bot is easy to manipulate and to move and to upkeep, it makes for an easy game. It makes for a very, very challenging game. Because absolutely guaranteed, no matter what your strategy is, at some point, the token is going to move on to a space where it's going to disrupt your flow. It's going to affect what you were trying to do. It's going to take that dice that you were after. And it's just going to make things a little bit difficult for you. There are certain strategies, I'm sure, with people who are very, very, very good at these types of games, and where people can work it out, not to be solvable every time, but where the challenge is potentially a little bit lessened for them. And that's okay, because in the instruction book and the instruction manual, it does give you absolutely a way to make the game harder for yourself as well. You'll start off on the easiest go, and it will make it harder. But as you can see, working with the AI bot, there's minimal upkeep on that. You're just flipping that coin, moving the token, taking a dice, and then you are taking the action from wherever that dice came from. You'll do that, and every map phase, you'll then shuffle those tokens and start all over again. Working the AI bot is an absolute breeze. Which in the solo game is exactly what it needs to be. And certainly when you first start playing the solo game, you see, despite looking like a simplified version almost of Teotihuacan, and it is in terms of its upkeep and in terms of how quickly the rounds can go once you're familiar with the game, I think my first game took maybe 2.5, 3 hours while I was trying to remember all the interconnected moves and referring constantly back to the manual to understand what did what. So initially there's a little bit of a steep learning curve on this game. It's quite not overly complex, and if you play plenty of Euros, you played any any of the T games or any other games from Turczi or Tascini, or even Lacerda games, and you'll have a grip on kind of what happens. It's just understanding all the iconography and what does what. It's mainly intuitive, the iconography, but even now, after playing the game maybe, 7 or 8 times, I still have to refer back to the rule books. And certainly from a solo perspective, because the god actions for Bottom Carmen are slightly different to the god actions for the player themselves. So yeah, you start to have this initial wall of potentially kind of high learning curve that hits you when you start playing the game. And is that problematic? Well, maybe, but it creates this nice healthy challenge at the beginning of your playing experience of the game. At no point did I feel totally overwhelmed when I started playing Tekhenu. I may have got some stuff wrong in my first game. In fact, I definitely got stuff wrong in my first and second and maybe even third game. I didn't mind so much. You see, from a solo perspective, we get to have that time. We get to not worry about any AP other than our own AP, so we can work through those rules mistakes. However, also from a solo perspective, you've not necessarily got anybody to tell you that you're playing a rule wrong, and that becomes almost a analysis thing. So I would play a game, and I say the first one took a long time, and then I'd sit back and I'd go through the rules again and think, right, I got that wrong, and I didn't quite do that correct, and it would be lessened each and every time. So there's a commitment that's required from you from a solo perspective. But all told, what this does is it meshes into this really tight, not overly complicated once you know the mechanisms, solo game. I mean, as a solo experience, I think there is a phenomenal solo experience here. I much prefer this, and there's nothing wrong with Teotihuacan. It just never grabbed me. But I am much preferring playing Tekhenu to Teotihuacan. I think, you know, the rondel system in Teotihuacan, it's not necessarily confusing, but it's just a little bit disorienting. I find the upkeep far greater in Teotihuacan than I do in Tekhenu. I find this game a challenge. I think in the kind of 7 times I've played the game, I've won twice on the easy mode, and the rest of the times I've lost. And that's not bad, but one of those times when I won, I think it was pure fluke. It wasn't necessarily a strategy I was going for. It was something just happened that allowed me to win. There are so many good things to like about this game. The mainly interconnected actions that you take and the ability to take any one of those actions is really, really genuinely very, very exciting, and you can plan out looking at where the disc is going to turn as to what your future actions are going to be. The fact that the cards play such an important part in it as well, these blessings and technologies and decree cards do not, as I say, my first game, I maybe didn't invest enough time in those, do not forget about those cards. The fact that the bot does create a decent challenge for you as well. And irrespective of, well, I've lost the game by a massive margin, but when you're playing well, you know, the margin between you and the bot isn't necessarily that great in terms of the final score. And that's a really interesting thing. And yes, you can make it more difficult for yourself. I've not got to that position yet because at the moment I don't have a win ratio to do that. There's lots, you know, the quality of the components. You get these wooden kind of columns and buildings, etc. And the dice are nice and chunky. It all feels really, really, really good. And then, of course, you have the central obelisk, which I particularly like, although some people don't, and you know, they feel it blocks their view of the game. So I think for me, from a solo perspective, this game, in the kind of 7 or 8 times I've played it since I got it, has moved into my top 10 list of solo games this year. I think it's an exceptionally fantastic solo dice drafting, worker placement Euro game. Does it make it perfect? No, because there are just a few issues with the game. Issue number 1. The Tekhenu itself, the obelisk itself, I like it. I think it's fantastically thematic. It will always be on the board for me. I liked its presence on there. It kind of just helps a little bit in terms of visual flair on the board itself. But the problem comes when I'm trying to see what's happening over on the other side of the obelisk, not only for where the dice placement is, but what dice are available, and if there's any statues placed on there as well, because of course I can place statues as well as the AI, or Bot and Carmen can place statues. Now, from my perspective, it's not too bad. I'm a solo player. I just lean around the table, move the chair, and that's okay. But if you're playing this with more people and you're all sat at various parts of the table, you know, and if you've got a long table and somebody sat at that end, you're going to have to start asking people at this end what's behind the obelisk, and therefore, you know, it's a little bit problematic. What I think would be nice in there is just to add a disc onto there, which would reduce the thematic element of the game, but would have allowed, when it's played with more people, the ability to see over that obelisk itself. Now, that's not the only kind of issue about the game as well. You see, one of my key things is, I think the rulebook is, it's okay. It's okay. It's laid out in a slightly weird way, but it's okay. You can work yourself through it in within a couple of games. It's pretty good, you know. But you will have to refer back to it a lot because there are a lot of actions to take from this. The key thing for me is the other player aids. They are pretty much next to useless, to tell you the truth. They tell you what each god does and kind of what the dice affinities are and what the shading affinity is on the pillar steps, but they don't tell you enough about anything. And unfortunately, I think that maybe that the publishers think that people are going to play this game so much that they won't have to refer back to the rule book. And it's a great game, and I've played it a lot. but every time I play it, I still have to refer back to this rulebook, and I'm constantly skipping forwards and backwards in the rulebook to find out what happens when I take a Ra action or a Bastet God action, and then in a separate section, I then have to go to, find out what Bottom Carmen does when he takes a God action on there, and then also because some of these cards have all the cards have iconography on them. So as you can see from these cards, there's various amounts of iconography on there. Not all of it is necessarily intuitive, and what they've got in the back is a table. Rather than showing you each and every card, each card has a very tiny number on there, a very tiny identifying number on there, and then you look here to find out what that tiny identifying number means. There are some fantastic user-created player aids on BGG, and I would absolutely encourage you to go out onto BGG and get some of these user-created player aids, because you're going to need them. You're going to play the game, you're going to put it away for a few weeks or whatever, you're going to get it out again, and you're not going to be able to remember exactly what everything does. And keeping referring back to this particular rulebook is a bit of a bind. Another thing from a solo perspective, and I don't understand why this happened, I like the pyramid. I like the fact that you are moving along and your Deben token's moving up there and dictating what actions you're going to take. What I don't like is this god-awful flipping coin. It's too big, it's unwieldy, it just flies off everywhere. It's absolutely horrible. I don't know why, first of all, they didn't make this smaller. Secondly, it would have been great as a metal coin. That would have been fantastic. Thirdly, why they included it at all. I don't understand why David Turczi felt the need to change the system from Teotihuacan, which worked very, very well in terms of how that bot moves across the tiles, to this. Maybe it's because there are more actions, and that could well be the case here. I'm sure David will know. He has far more experience in this than me, but I preferred that system in Teotihuacan to this system in Tekhenu. This is next to useless. Invariably what I do is I use a coin, and head will take me up the board and tails will take me across the board, or I assign a spare dice to it and I will use 1, 3 and 5 to go up the board and 2, 4 and 6 to go across the board. My recommendation is don't try and use this. You will just get really, really, really frustrated with this pretty poor design choice there. Other than those kind of relatively minor quibbles, I find it difficult to pick much fault with this game. From the moment I got it onto the table and started learning it, and say the rulebook maybe not the best in the world, it's certainly not the worst in the world, not by a long stretch, but from the moment I started playing it, I got the feeling I was really, really, really going to like this game. And you know what? I think it is a fantastic, fantastic solo experience. I've not played it with anybody else, but I can say from my perspective that this is a truly, truly wonderful solo game. So there we go. That's my solo review of Tekhenu, Obelisk of the Sun, designed by Daniele Tascini and David Turczi and published by Board and Dice. The solo game is absolutely fantastic. I think there is a continuing challenge in the solo game. It will be interesting to see if they start to release more kind of expansions for this game like they've done with Teotihuacan, to see if this game grows. And even if it doesn't, I think what they've created here is an exemplar solo experience for this particular type of game. It's relatively accessible. It's not as hard in terms of or difficult and confusing in terms of the upkeep as Teotihuacan is, and the experience once you get to play the game is you can play a solo game within about an hour or so, and that's fantastic. A little bit of setup time, a little bit of teardown time, but you can play a game in about an hour or so, depending on how you're thinking and what your choices are and what your strategy is, and it's a fantastic experience. It's one that keeps coming out to my table, and it will continue to do so. So yes, thank you very much for joining me, Not Board Gaming, on this journey through the solo experience of Tekhenu. As I say, this is Not Board Gaming. Remember, you can always follow us on Facebook and on Instagram, and that's Not Board Gaming, always B-O-R-E-D. Do not forget to kind of like and subscribe to the channel. Check out our other videos as well, and please, kind of smash the bell button as well to make sure that you get notified of any of my future videos. And one final thought: if you can't find anybody else to play with, there's nothing wrong with playing with yourselves. Until next time.